It's 1929. The sun is setting over the Pacific Ocean, casting golden light across the rugged coastline of Catalina Island. And rising from the hills like something out of a Mediterranean dream stands a mansion so magnificent, so impossibly extravagant, that it would make even the Vanderbilts pause. But here's what makes this story different from every other Gilded Age mansion tale you've heard. This palace wasn't built by old money. It wasn't constructed by railroad barons or steel magnates or shipping tycoons who inherited their empires. No, this was built by a man who started his career selling soap door to door. A man who would turn $5 sticks of chewing gum into one of the greatest fortunes in American history. And unlike Biltmore, unlike the Newport cottages, unlike every other grand estate that either survived as a museum or crumbled into dust, this mansion simply vanished. Not slowly, not through gradual decay or demolition. It was deliberately erased, as if someone wanted to make sure the world forgot it ever existed. The Wrigley Estate on Catalina Island. Most people have never heard of it, and there's a reason for that. But before we get to the darkness, before we understand why this incredible place was lost, we need to understand what it was. And trust me, what it was will blow your mind. Let's start with the basics, though calling them basics seems almost insulting. The main residence, perched 350 feet above Avalon Bay, contained 37 rooms. Now, 37 rooms might not sound as impressive as Biltmore's 250, but remember the context. This wasn't on the mainland with access to railways and supply chains. This was on an island 26 miles off the coast of California, an island that Wrigley himself owned. Every single brick, every piece of marble, every light fixture, every tile had to be shipped across open ocean. The mansion sprawled across multiple levels built into the hillside itself, creating a cascading effect of terraces, gardens, and patios that seemed to flow down the mountain toward the sea. The architecture was Spanish colonial revival meets Mediterranean villa, with white stucco walls, red tile roofs, elaborate wrought iron work, and hand-painted tiles imported from Spain and Mexico. The estate wasn't just one building. The property included the main house, multiple guest houses, servant quarters, stables, a garage that could house a dozen vehicles, elaborate gardens with fountains and reflecting pools, tennis courts, and infrastructure that essentially made it a self-contained village. The views were beyond description. From nearly every room, you could see the Pacific Ocean stretching to the horizon. On clear days, you could see the California mainland 26 miles away. At night, you could see the lights of Los Angeles twinkling in the distance. The estate sat like a crown on the island, visible from the water, a declaration of one man's vision and wealth. But the numbers only tell part of the story. What really made the Wrigley Estate extraordinary was the vision behind it. This wasn't just a rich man's vanity project. William Wrigley Jr. had a plan for Catalina Island that was breathtaking in its ambition. He wanted to turn this remote, nice, barely developed island into America's premier resort destination. The mansion was just the centerpiece. Wrigley invested millions developing the island's infrastructure. He built the town of Avalon from practically nothing, constructing hotels, a casino, a ballroom that could host thousands, a movie theater, restaurants, shops. He created a steamship line to ferry tourists from the mainland. He built roads across the island's rugged terrain. He imported bison for a movie shoot and let them roam wild, creating an unexpected tourist attraction that exists to this day. He even brought his Chicago Cubs baseball team to Catalina for spring training, building a baseball field and turning the island into a destination for sports fans. The estate itself was designed not just as a home, but as a showplace where Wrigley could entertain business associates, politicians, celebrities, and investors. This was the era when deals were made over cigars and brandy in private estates, and Wrigley understood that power and influence required the right setting. The construction of the estate began in the early 1920s and continued for years. The challenges were immense. Everything had to be barged across the channel, then hauled up the steep hillside to the construction site. Wrigley employed hundreds of workers, many living on the island during construction. Italian craftsmen were brought in for the tile work. Spanish artisans created the elaborate ironwork. Gardeners designed the terraced gardens that would bloom year-round in Catalina's Mediterranean climate. The main entrance featured a massive wooden door that opened into a grand foyer with hand-painted tiles covering the floors in intricate patterns. A sweeping staircase curved upward, its wrought iron railing a masterpiece of metalwork. The living spaces were designed for both intimate family gatherings and large-scale entertaining. The formal living room could comfortably host 50 guests. Floor-to-ceiling windows could be opened to let in the ocean breeze, essentially removing the barrier between indoor and outdoor space. The dining room featured a table that could seat 24, surrounded by walls decorated with original oil paintings and Spanish colonial antiques Wrigley had collected. A massive fireplace dominated one end of the room, though the mild Catalina climate rarely required its use. The library was Wrigley's personal sanctuary, lined with built-in bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes. This was where he conducted business, read the newspapers from the mainland that arrived daily by boat, and planned his next ventures. Unlike George Vanderbilt's scholarly collection, Wrigley's library was more practical, filled with business journals, agricultural texts, and books on development and tourism. The master suite occupied an entire wing of the house. Separate bedrooms for William and his wife Ada connected through a shared sitting room. Both rooms featured private balconies with those spectacular ocean views. The bathrooms were Art Deco masterpieces with imported Italian marble, gold fixtures, and separate dressing rooms larger than most people's bedrooms. But here's what really set the Wrigley Estate apart: the outdoor spaces. In California's climate, outdoor living was essential, and Wrigley understood this better than most. Multiple terraces cascaded down the hillside, each with its own character and purpose. The main terrace, directly off the living room, could host 100 guests for cocktail parties. Wicker furniture, colorful cushions, potted palms, and hanging flowers created a tropical paradise atmosphere. A lower terrace featured a reflecting pool surrounded by carefully manicured gardens. Another terrace was designed for intimate dinners with a built-in barbecue and bar area. The gardens themselves were extraordinary. Remember, this was an island with limited fresh water, yet Wrigley created lush landscapes that rivaled any mainland estate. He built a sophisticated water system, installing tanks to collect and store water, creating an irrigation network that kept everything green and blooming. Bougainvillea cascaded over walls in explosions of pink and purple. Palm trees swayed in the ocean breeze. Exotic flowers imported from around the world created a riot of color. Winding paths led through the gardens, creating intimate spaces and spectacular viewpoints. The guest houses on the property were substantial structures in their own right, each with multiple bedrooms, full kitchens, and private outdoor spaces. Important guests, business partners, celebrities visiting the island, they'd stay in these houses, essentially having their own private villas while remaining on the estate grounds. The servants' quarters, while more modest, were still impressive by the standards of the day. Wrigley learned from other estate owners that treating staff well was essential for smooth operations. The quarters included dormitory-style rooms for single staff, small apartments for married couples, a communal dining area, and recreational space. Running an estate this size, this remote, required an army of people. At peak operation, the Wrigley Estate employed over 60 staff members. A house manager oversaw the entire operation, coordinating between different departments like a corporate executive. A head butler managed the formal service, training footmen and servers to handle the elaborate dinners and parties Wrigley hosted. A head housekeeper commanded a team of maids who maintained the spotless condition of every room. This wasn't easy. Salt air from the ocean meant constant cleaning to prevent corrosion and buildup. A chef and kitchen staff of 8 prepared meals, not just for the family, but for guests, for staff, sometimes for hundreds of people when Wrigley hosted his famous parties. Multiple gardeners worked full-time maintaining the elaborate landscapes. This wasn't seasonal work. In Catalina's climate, plants grew year-round, meaning constant pruning, planting, and maintenance. Chauffeurs maintained and drove the collection of automobiles, though on an island, driving was limited. Still, Wrigley had built roads around the estate and into Avalon, and appearance mattered. Maintenance staff worked endlessly on repairs. The salt air corroded metal, faded paint, and damaged wood. An estate this exposed to the elements required constant vigilance. Security personnel patrolled the grounds. With valuable art, antiques, and Wrigley himself, one of America's wealthiest men, security wasn't optional. A personal secretary managed Wrigley's correspondence and schedule. Even on vacation, business never stopped. The logistics of maintaining this estate were staggering. A supply boat arrived from the mainland 3 times weekly, bringing fresh food, mail, supplies, parts for repairs, everything needed to keep the estate functioning. A radio room kept Wrigley connected to his business empire on the mainland. This was cutting-edge technology in the 1920s. Long before cell phones or internet, Wrigley could receive business updates, stock prices, and news almost in real time. The estate had its own power generation system. While Avalon had electricity, Wrigley didn't want to depend on the town's infrastructure. Backup generators ensured the lights never went out. A sophisticated water system not only supplied the house and gardens, but included a fire suppression system. On an island with limited firefighting resources, this was essential. The annual operating costs for the Wrigley Estate were estimated at over $500,000 in 1920s money. That's roughly $8 million today, every year, just to keep it running. For most people, these numbers would be crushing. For Wrigley, they were barely noticeable. Because by the late 1920s, William Wrigley Jr. was one of the 10 wealthiest men in America. His fortune was estimated at over $34 million, equivalent to well over $500 million today. And unlike many Gilded Age fortunes built on monopolies or ruthless business practices, Wrigley built his empire on something absolutely ordinary: chewing gum. But to understand why the Wrigley Estate ultimately vanished, to understand the darkness that would eventually consume this paradise, we need to understand the man who built it. Because William Wrigley Jr. was nothing like the other business titans of his era, and his story is far more fascinating than you might imagine. William Wrigley Jr. was born in Philadelphia on September 30th, 1861, just as America was tearing itself apart in Civil War. His father, William Wrigley Sr., ran a small soap manufacturing business, scraping by in a competitive market. Young William, called Willie by his family, was not a promising student. He was restless, rebellious, constantly in trouble at school. At 11 years old, he ran away from home, hopping a freight train to New York City with nothing but the clothes on his back. He was found and returned home, but the incident revealed something essential about Willie's character. He was ambitious, fearless to the point of recklessness, and completely unwilling to accept the ordinary life his circumstances suggested. At 13, his father pulled him out of school and put him to work at the soap factory. This wasn't a gentle introduction to business. Willie worked the production line, stirring massive vats of boiling soap, working 12-hour days in brutal conditions. But his father also sent him on the road as a salesman. Starting at age 13, Willie traveled alone through Pennsylvania and beyond, pulling a cart loaded with soap, going door to door, town to town, selling his father's products. This was his real education, not in classrooms, but on the road, learning how to talk to people, how to read customers, how to close a sale, how to survive rejection after rejection and keep going. By his early 20s, Willie had become his father's best salesman, but he'd also developed ideas that his conservative father found alarming. Willie believed in advertising, in spending money to make money, in bold gestures that would grab attention. His father believed in thrift, in steady, slow growth, in proven methods. The conflict was inevitable. In 1891, at age 30, Willie moved to Chicago with $32 in his pocket. $32. The man who would build one of America's grandest estates started with barely enough money to rent a room for a month. Chicago in the 1890s was exploding. The World's Fair was coming in 1893. The city was rebuilding after the Great Fire. Opportunity was everywhere, and Willie Wrigley Jr. was determined to seize it. He started by selling his father's soap, but Willie added a twist. With each purchase, he offered a premium, a free gift. This was revolutionary at the time. Instead of just selling soap, he was selling soap plus something extra. The premiums were cheap items, baking powder being one of the most popular. But Willie noticed something interesting. Customers were more excited about the baking powder than the soap. So Willie pivoted. He started selling baking powder and offering other products as premiums. One of these premiums was chewing gum. In the 1890s, chewing gum was a novelty item, barely a business at all. A few small companies made it, but it was considered somewhat vulgar, not quite respectable. But Willie noticed his customers loved it. They'd come back asking for more gum, not caring about the baking powder. And that's when Willie Wrigley Jr. saw the future. He'd sell chewing gum directly, not as a premium, but as the product itself. In 1893, he launched his first two chewing gum brands, Lotta and Vassar. They failed. The market was already crowded with other small gum manufacturers. Willie lost money. Most people would have quit. Willie doubled down. In 1893, he launched Juicy Fruit. Weeks later, he launched Spearmint. And these would change everything. But launching the products wasn't enough. Willie understood something that other gum manufacturers didn't. Success wasn't about having the best product, though Wrigley gum was high quality. Success was about advertising, about making your brand the one customers remembered and trusted. Willie spent money on advertising that seemed insane to his competitors. He bought newspaper ads, billboard space, streetcar cards. He spent more on advertising than he made in sales, going deep into debt, betting everything that brand recognition would eventually pay off. In 1907, Willie had an idea that seemed absolutely crazy. He would send free samples of Wrigley's Spearmint gum to every single person listed in every telephone directory in America. Millions of free samples. The cost was astronomical. His accountants and advisors begged him not to do it. Willie did it anyway, and it worked brilliantly. Suddenly, everyone in America had tried Wrigley's gum. When they went to stores, they asked for it by name. Retailers started stocking it because customers demanded it. Within a few years, Wrigley's was the best-selling chewing gum in America. By 1910, Willie's annual profits exceeded $1 million. By 1920, his fortune had grown exponentially. Wrigley's gum was sold worldwide. The factories in Chicago ran 3 shifts, producing millions of sticks of gum daily. But Willie didn't just sell gum. He understood vertical integration before that term was common. He bought sugar plantations to control his supply of sweetener. He invested in chicle plantations in Mexico, controlling the tree sap that was gum's primary ingredient. He bought the suppliers, the distributors, the retailers when possible. Unlike many business titans who became conservative once they achieved success, Willie remained aggressive, constantly advertising, constantly innovating. He sponsored radio programs. He created memorable slogans. He put Wrigley's logos everywhere. His name became synonymous with quality and with aggressive, cheerful American capitalism. Willie also invested in other ventures. In 1916, he became a minority owner of the Chicago Cubs baseball team. By 1921, he owned the team outright. He built Wrigley Field, which still stands today, one of baseball's most beloved stadiums. But his most audacious investment came in 1919 when he purchased Santa Catalina Island. The island, 26 miles off the coast of Southern California, was rugged, undeveloped, and remote. A few hundred people lived there, mostly in the small town of Avalon. Tourism was minimal. Most people thought Willie was crazy for buying it. Why would a chewing gum magnate want a rocky island in the Pacific? But Willie saw potential. Southern California was booming. Los Angeles was growing rapidly. Wealthy people wanted escape destinations. And here was an island close enough to reach but remote enough to feel exotic, with perfect weather, beautiful scenery, and no development. Willie paid $3 million for Catalina Island. Then he spent millions more transforming it. He built the casino building in Avalon, not a gambling hall, but an entertainment complex with a ballroom that could host 4,000 dancers and a movie theater that was one of the finest in America. He built hotels, restaurants, and infrastructure. He created the Santa Catalina Island Company to manage everything. And in the hills above Avalon, on a site with the most spectacular views on the island, Willie began building his personal estate. This wouldn't be his primary residence. Willie had a mansion in Pasadena on the mainland, an estate in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, an apartment in Chicago. But the Catalina estate would be his refuge, his private paradise where he could escape the pressures of business and enjoy the fruits of his extraordinary success. Willie was in his 60s by the time construction began. He'd built his empire through force of will, working 100-hour weeks, traveling constantly, driving himself relentlessly. Now, finally, he could create something just for himself and his family. The construction of the estate proceeded through the early 1920s. Willie was deeply involved, making decisions about every detail. He wanted the house to feel Mediterranean, reflecting the island's climate and his love of European aesthetics. But he also wanted modern conveniences, cutting-edge technology, everything that would make the estate comfortable and impressive. The guest houses were built to host important visitors. Willie entertained constantly: business associates, politicians, celebrities, society figures. Everyone wanted to visit Catalina, and staying at Wrigley's estate was the ultimate invitation. Willie hosted elaborate parties at the estate. Orchestras would be brought to the island to play on the terraces. Chefs from mainland restaurants would prepare multi-course dinners. The terraces would be lit with thousands of lights, visible from Avalon below, a glowing jewel on the hillside. Guests would arrive by boat, then be driven up the winding road to the estate in Willie's fleet of automobiles. They'd be greeted with champagne, shown to their guest houses, then brought to the main residence for dinner. The entertainment was legendary. Musicians, dancers, performers brought from Los Angeles. The parties would continue until dawn, with guests wandering the gardens, swimming in the ocean below, enjoying the mild Catalina nights. Willie's wife, Ada, was his partner in all of this. They'd married in 1885 when both were young and struggling. She'd supported him through the early failures, the financial struggles, the years of uncertainty. Now, in their 60s, they were enjoying success together, though Ada's health was beginning to fail. Their son, Philip, was being groomed to take over the business empire. Willie was building a dynasty, and the Catalina estate was a symbol of that dynasty's permanence. But there's a dark irony in building monuments to permanence, because nothing, you saw, not even the greatest fortunes, lasts forever. In the same year that Willie was putting finishing touches on his island paradise, forces were gathering that would shake America to its core. The year was 1929, and everything was about to change. The stock market crash of October 1929 didn't immediately destroy the Wrigley fortune. Unlike many tycoons whose wealth was primarily in stocks, Willie's fortune was in tangible assets: factories, property, his chewing gum business, which continued selling even during hard times. Chewing gum was affordable, a small pleasure people could still enjoy when luxuries became impossible. But the crash changed everything else. The development of Catalina Island, which had been proceeding brilliantly through the 1920s, suddenly stalled. Tourism collapsed as Americans could no longer afford vacations. The steamship line lost money. The hotels emptied. The ambitious plans for further development were shelved. Willie, now approaching 70, faced challenges he hadn't anticipated. But Willie Wrigley Jr. didn't become one of America's wealthiest men by giving up when things got difficult. He continued investing in Catalina, believing the depression would pass and tourism would return. He kept the steamship line running at a loss. He maintained the estate at enormous expense. He refused to retreat. Then, on January 26, 1932, everything ended. Willie Wrigley Jr. died suddenly at his Catalina estate. He was 70 years old. The official cause was heart failure, but those who knew him said he'd simply worked himself to death. Even in his final years, he'd maintained a punishing schedule, trying to manage his business empire while dealing with the Depression's impact. He'd built one of America's great fortunes from absolutely nothing. He'd transformed an island into a destination. He'd created an estate that rivaled anything built by the robber barons. And he'd done it all starting with $32 and a cart full of soap. Willie's death would prove to be the beginning of the end for the Catalina estate, though nobody realized it at the time. His son Philip inherited everything: the chewing gum company, Catalina Island, the estate, all of it. Philip was in his late 30s, educated, trained in the business. On paper, he was ready, but Philip was not his father. Willie had been a force of nature, a man whose ambition and drive seemed limitless. Philip was more conservative, more cautious. Where Willie saw opportunities, Philip saw risks, and the Depression was making everything risky. The Wrigley Company continued successfully. Chewing gum sales remained strong, but the other investments, particularly Catalina Island, were hemorrhaging money. The island's development had cost millions. It was generating almost no revenue. The steamship line alone was losing thousands of dollars weekly. Philip faced a choice: continue his father's vision, subsidizing the island indefinitely, or cut losses and retreat. For a few years, Philip tried to maintain everything. The estate remained staffed and operational. The family used it, though less frequently than Willie had. The island's facilities stayed open, waiting for tourists who weren't coming. But by the mid-1930s, the financial pressure was becoming unsustainable. The estate's annual operating cost remained massive. The staff had to be paid. Maintenance couldn't be deferred. The gardens required constant care. And for what? The Depression showed no signs of ending. Tourism remained depressed. The estate was consuming hundreds of thousands of dollars annually while generating nothing. Philip began making cuts. The staff was reduced. Some of the guest houses were closed. Maintenance was deferred on non-essential items. The elaborate parties stopped. The estate, which had been built for entertaining and showcasing the Wrigley dynasty, sat increasingly empty. Ada Wrigley, Willie's widow, continued living part-time at the estate, but her health was failing. The woman who had stood beside Willie through his rise from soap salesman to magnate was now a widow watching her husband's dreams slowly crumble. Then came World War II. Suddenly, Catalina Island wasn't a tourist destination anymore. It was a strategic location. The U.S. military took over much of the island, using it for training and coastal defense. Tourism was completely shut down. The steamship service was suspended. The island was essentially militarized. The estate became untenable during the war. The military presence, the security concerns, the impossibility of maintaining such a property during wartime meant the Wrigley family largely abandoned it. The staff was reduced to a skeleton crew. Many of the furnishings were moved to the mainland for safekeeping. The house sat mostly empty, a ghost of its former grandeur. When the war ended in 1945, Philip Wrigley faced reality. The estate had been closed for years. The cost of restoring it to its former glory would be enormous. Tourism was returning to Catalina, but slowly. The post-war world was different. America was different. The era of massive private estates was over. Estate taxes had become punitive. Income taxes had skyrocketed. The idea of maintaining a 60-person staff to run a vacation home seemed not just expensive, but obscene. Public attitudes had changed. During the Depression and war, Americans had developed different feelings about massive wealth and conspicuous consumption. What once seemed impressive now seemed wasteful. Philip made the decision that would erase the estate from history. He would not restore it. He would not maintain it. Instead, the estate would be closed permanently. What happened next is where the story gets truly dark, where we see how something magnificent can simply vanish. The decision to close the estate was just the beginning. The question was what to do with it. Sell it? Impossible. Who would buy a massive mansion on an island in the late 1940s? Even wealthy buyers weren't interested in the maintenance costs and complexity. Donate it? To whom? It was too expensive for any nonprofit to maintain. Turn it into a hotel or resort? The Wrigley family considered this, but ultimately decided against it. The estate was too personal, too connected to Willie's memory. The family didn't want strangers sleeping in rooms where Willie had lived. So the estate sat empty through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. The salt air began its corrosive work. Without constant maintenance, the gardens grew wild, the paint faded, the ironwork rusted, the house began deteriorating. A skeleton crew still visited occasionally, but they were maintaining a corpse, not a living estate. Vandals discovered the property. Despite security, people broke in, stealing fixtures, furniture that remained, anything valuable. Windows were broken. Graffiti appeared on those beautiful hand-painted tiles. The reflecting pools cracked and filled with debris. Philip watched this happening and made a harder decision. The estate would be demolished. Not slowly through neglect, but deliberately, systematically erased. The family would reclaim what they could, and the rest would be destroyed. The demolition began in the late 1950s. It wasn't a single event, but a process that took months. First, anything valuable was removed. Furniture, art, fixtures, tiles, ironwork. If it could be salvaged, it was taken to the mainland or to other Wrigley properties. Then the actual demolition began. The main house was taken apart methodically. The beautiful Spanish tiles were pulled up, many destroyed in the process. The hand-carved wooden doors were removed. The elaborate wrought iron work was cut down. The windows were removed from their frames. The structure itself was demolished piece by piece. Unlike modern demolitions where buildings are imploded in seconds, this was slow, deliberate dismantling. The guest houses were demolished next. Then the servant quarters, then the stables and garages. The terraces were bulldozed, the gardens were torn out, the irrigation systems were ripped up. Everything that made the estate magnificent was systematically destroyed. By the early 1960s, almost nothing remained. The site where the mansion had stood was graded flat. Native vegetation was planted to hide the scars. Roads leading to the estate were closed and allowed to deteriorate. Within a few years, nature began reclaiming the hillside. Why? Why would the family do this? Several reasons, all practical but collectively tragic. First, taxes. If the estate didn't exist, it couldn't be taxed. An empty, deteriorating mansion was still assessed property value, generating tax bills with no corresponding income. Second, liability. An abandoned estate was a lawsuit waiting to happen. If someone broke in and got injured, the family could be held responsible. Better to eliminate the risk entirely. Third, image management. The Wrigley family business was consumer-facing. They sold chewing gum to ordinary Americans. Having an abandoned mansion rotting on an island while still owning it sent the wrong message. Better that it simply disappear. Fourth, and perhaps most painful, the estate had become a monument to failure. Willie had built it as a symbol of achievement, but its abandonment symbolized the Depression's impact, the war's disruption, the end of an era. For Philip, it was a constant reminder of his father's dreams that he couldn't maintain. The demolition was kept relatively quiet. There were no newspaper stories, no public outcry. Most people didn't even know the estate had existed, and that was exactly what the family wanted. The site today is almost unrecognizable. If you hike to the location, and few people do, you can find remnants. Pieces of foundation, fragments of tile, sections of retaining wall. The terraces, if you know where to look, are still visible as subtle changes in the hillside's contour. But nothing remains that would tell you a magnificent mansion once stood there. The contrast with other Gilded Age estates is stark and instructive. Biltmore survives because the Vanderbilt descendants made it a business, adapting constantly to remain financially viable. The Newport Mansion survived mostly as museums, taken over by preservation societies. Hearst Castle was donated to California and became a state park. But the Wrigley Estate, it was simply erased. And in that erasure, we see something profound about wealth, legacy, and the American experience. Willie Wrigley Jr. built his fortune on optimism, on aggressive expansion, on believing that anything was possible with enough ambition and marketing. But fortunes built on momentum collapse when that momentum stops. The Depression stopped it. The war stopped it. Changing social attitudes stopped it. Willie's estate was built on the assumption that the good times would last forever, that tourism would always grow, that maintaining massive private estates would always be possible and desirable. But history doesn't respect assumptions. The economic models that made sense in the 1920s collapsed in the 1930s. The social acceptance of extreme wealth concentration changed. The tax structures that allowed massive estates became punitive. And Willie's spectacular vision, built with such ambition and expense, became financially impossible to maintain. There's a painful irony here. Willie Wrigley Jr. was far more generous and civic-minded than many Gilded Age tycoons. He invested in Catalina Island not just for himself, but to create a destination for thousands of visitors. He built public facilities, created jobs, improved infrastructure. His legacy on Catalina Island includes things that still serve the public today. The Wrigley Memorial and Botanical Garden, built after his death, remains a beautiful tribute. The casino building still stands as Avalon's centerpiece. The infrastructure he built still supports the island's tourism economy. But his private estate, the place he built for himself and his family, gone. Completely gone. And the lesson? Maybe it's this. Public legacies endure, but private extravagance is temporary. The things Willie built for himself vanished. The things he built for others remain. Or maybe the lesson is darker. Nothing lasts. Not fortunes, not monuments, not dreams. Willie Wrigley Jr. started with $32 and built an empire. He bought an island. He constructed a paradise. And within 30 years of his death, his paradise was deliberately erased, as if it had never existed. Today, very few people even know the Wrigley Estate existed. There are a handful of old photographs, mostly in private collections or archives. A few elderly Catalina residents remember hearing stories from their grandparents about the mansion in the hills. But for most people, the story is completely unknown. In researching this script, finding information about the estate was remarkably difficult. Unlike Biltmore or the Newport mansions, which have been extensively documented, photographed, and studied, the Wrigley Estate exists mostly in fragments. A mention in a book about Catalina Island history, a single paragraph in a biography of William Wrigley Jr., a few faded photographs in a museum archive. It's as if the family's desire to erase it succeeded almost completely. The site itself is on private property, still owned by the Wrigley family or the Catalina Island Company. There are no tours, no historical markers, no acknowledgement that anything significant once stood there. If you visit Catalina Island today, you can tour the Wrigley Memorial. You can visit the casino building. You can see the evidence of Willie's public investments everywhere. But his private estate? It's a ghost story, whispered about by locals, unknown to tourists, deliberately forgotten. And perhaps that's fitting. The Gilded Age was America's era of maximum private excess. Robber barons built palaces that would make European aristocrats envious. They accumulated wealth beyond imagination and displayed it through massive estates, elaborate parties, conspicuous consumption. Some of those estates survived by transforming into museums or businesses. They endure as monuments to that era, allowing us to see and understand what Gilded Age wealth looked like. But most vanished, demolished for taxes, destroyed by maintenance costs, sold and subdivided, forgotten. The Wrigley Estate's complete erasure is unusual in its thoroughness, but common in its outcome. The America that allowed and celebrated such estates no longer exists. The tax structures changed. The social attitudes changed. The economic models changed. What seemed not just possible but normal in 1929 became impossible by 1949. Willie Wrigley Jr.'s story remains inspiring. A man with minimal education and no advantages built one of America's great business empires through innovation, determination, and brilliant marketing. His company still exists today, still sells chewing gum worldwide, still bears his name. That legacy endures. His public investments in Catalina Island endure. Thousands of tourists visit the island annually, enjoying what Willie created for them. But his personal dream, that magnificent estate overlooking the Pacific, exists now only in faded photographs and distant memories. It's a reminder that private luxury is temporary, that maintenance costs are forever, that what one generation builds, the next generation often cannot or will not preserve. That visibility attracts attention, and sometimes families want things to simply disappear. The Wrigley Estate was demolished not because of neglect or disaster, but because maintaining it became impossible and its existence became inconvenient. The family made a practical decision that happened to erase a significant piece of architectural and social history, and in doing so, they demonstrated something important about American attitudes toward wealth and legacy. We preserve some things, the things we collectively decide matter. Public buildings, museums, parks, monuments. But private excess? We let that disappear, often with relief. The same culture that once celebrated Gilded Age mansions came to view them as embarrassments, symbols of inequality and waste. Better they vanish, we decided, than remain as uncomfortable reminders of America's age of extreme wealth concentration. Willie Wrigley Jr. died believing his estate would stand for generations. He built it to last, using the best materials and craftsmen. He created beauty that was meant to endure. But durability isn't just about construction quality. It's about continued financial viability, public support, and descendants willing to carry the burden. His descendants made different choices, practical choices, financially sound choices, but choices that erase something magnificent. Today, if you stand on that hillside above Avalon, you see native plants, scrub brush, rocky terrain. You see the Pacific Ocean stretching to the horizon, the same view that Willie Wrigley loved. But you see no trace of what once stood there. No ruins romantically crumbling. No foundations inviting exploration. Nothing but the hillside, looking as if no human hand ever shaped it. This complete erasure creates a strange feeling. At Biltmore, you can walk the same floors George Vanderbilt walked. At Hearst Castle, you can see the rooms where Hollywood stars partied. At the Newport Mansions, you can imagine yourself at a Gilded Age ball. But at the Wrigley Estate site, you can only imagine, and most people don't even know they should try. The photographs that survive show glimpses of what was lost. Black and white images of the main house, its white stucco walls glowing in the California sun, the elaborate terraces cascading down the hillside, the Spanish tile roofs, the wrought iron details, the gardens in full bloom. These photographs, rare and scattered across various archives, are all that remain, and they show something remarkable. The Wrigley Estate wasn't just another wealthy person's mansion. It was a genuine architectural achievement, a structure that successfully married Mediterranean aesthetics with California sensibility, that integrated indoor and outdoor space brilliantly, that took advantage of its spectacular setting in ways few buildings ever have. The architects and designers who created it did something special. And it's simply gone. There are people today who are trying to preserve the memory of the Wrigley Estate. Local historians on Catalina Island have collected photographs, interviewed people who remember it, documented its location and history. Small museums on the island have exhibits that mention it. A few books about Catalina Island's history include chapters about the estate, but these are niche efforts. The Wrigley Estate will never have the public recognition of other Gilded Age mansions because the physical structure doesn't exist. You can't tour it, you can't photograph it, you can't experience it. And in our visual culture, things that can't be photographed or experienced tend to fade from collective memory. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many other magnificent buildings, estates, and structures have been lost to history? How many other architectural achievements were demolished, erased, forgotten? The Wrigley Estate is unusual in how completely it vanished, but it's not alone. America has demolished thousands of significant buildings over the decades. Entire neighborhoods of architectural masterpieces have been bulldozed for highways or urban renewal. Grand hotels have been torn down for parking lots. Historic houses have been demolished for strip malls. We're not good at preservation as a culture. We prioritize development over history, practicality over beauty, the new over the old, and the Wrigley Estate's fate is, in many ways, typically American. We build big, we dream big, and then we tear it down when it becomes inconvenient. There's something almost aggressively American about the entire story. A man builds himself up from nothing through sheer determination and clever marketing. He makes a fortune selling something trivial, chewing gum, and uses that fortune to buy an island and build a palace. He lives large, entertains lavishly, and creates something spectacular. Then economic forces beyond anyone's control make the whole thing unsustainable. His descendants, practical people facing practical problems, make the rational decision to demolish it all. And within a generation, it's as if it never existed. Boom and bust, rise and fall, creation and destruction. The whole cycle compressed into a few decades. This is the American story in miniature. We don't have centuries of accumulated history like Europe. We don't preserve things for preservation's sake. We build, we abandon, we demolish, we rebuild. It's creative destruction on a societal scale, but something is lost in this process. Not just buildings, but stories, connections to the past, physical evidence of who we were and what we valued. The Wrigley Estate was more than just Willie's vacation home. It was a statement about American ambition, about what was possible when someone combined vision with resources. It demonstrated architectural achievement and showcased California's growing importance in American culture. And now it's gone, reduced to fragments and memories, a cautionary tale about the impermanence of everything we build. If Willie Wrigley Jr. could see what happened to his estate, what would he think? Would he be angry that his descendants demolished his dream? Or would he understand the practical realities they faced? Willie was a pragmatist. He built his fortune by adapting to market conditions, by pivoting when necessary, by making hard business decisions. Perhaps he would have approved of his family's choice. Better to demolish it cleanly than let it rot as a monument to faded glory. Better to cut losses than throw good money after bad. Better to preserve the profitable parts of his legacy, the chewing gum company, the public facilities on Catalina, and sacrifice the personal extravagance. Or perhaps he would be heartbroken. He built that estate with love, chose every detail carefully, imagined it as a family gathering place for generations. He couldn't have known that within 20 years of his death, economic and social forces would make his dream untenable. We'll never know. Willie died in 1932, believing his estate would endure. The truth that it wouldn't came later, gradually, as the costs mounted and the viability decreased. There's a broader context here that's worth understanding. The Gilded Age estates that survived did so for specific reasons. Biltmore survived because George Vanderbilt's descendants transformed it into a tourism business early enough that it could sustain itself. The estate generates revenue now, enough to cover its enormous operating costs. The Newport mansions survived largely because they were donated to or taken over by preservation societies. These nonprofits exist specifically to maintain historic properties. They're not trying to turn a profit, just cover costs through tours and events. Hearst Castle survived because William Randolph Hearst's family donated it to the state of California. It became a state park, maintained with public funds, accessible to anyone willing to make the drive up the California coast. But the Wrigley Estate had none of these paths available. It was too remote for easy tourism. The costs of maintaining it and ferrying tourists to it made a tourism business model dubious. No preservation society wanted the burden of maintaining a massive estate on an island. The state wasn't interested in taking it over, and the family, still wealthy and still in business, didn't need the tax deduction that donation would have provided. So it sat empty, deteriorating, becoming a bigger problem every year until demolition became the obvious solution. This points to a hard truth about architectural preservation. Buildings survive not because they're beautiful or historically significant, but because someone can figure out how to pay for their maintenance. Beauty and history matter, but economics always wins in the end. The Wrigley Estate was beautiful. It was historically significant, but nobody could figure out the economics of keeping it. So it's gone. And with it went a piece of California history, a piece of Gilded Age history, a piece of American architectural heritage. The loss is real, even if most people don't know to mourn it. There are lessons here about legacy and permanence. Willie Wrigley Jr. thought he was building something permanent. He used the best materials, the finest craftsmanship. He created beauty that should have lasted centuries. But permanence requires more than good construction. It requires continued investment, generation after generation. It requires descendants willing to carry the burden. It requires economic models that make sense across changing decades. And it requires public support, or at least public interest. The Wrigley Estate failed on several of these dimensions. The economic model never worked. Tourism never generated enough revenue to offset costs. The descendants weren't willing to subsidize it indefinitely. And the public never really knew it existed, so there was no pressure to preserve it. Willie's public legacies, the things he built for others, fared better. The Wrigley Memorial and Botanical Garden on Catalina Island still welcomes visitors. The casino building still anchors Avalon. Wrigley Field in Chicago still hosts baseball games, one of America's most beloved ballparks. The Wrigley Company still makes chewing gum. These legacies endure because they serve public purposes, generate revenue, or have achieved iconic status. But his personal dream? Gone. There's something poignant about this. The things Willie built for himself vanished. The things he built for others remain. It suggests that true immortality comes not from private luxury, but from public contribution. But that's a romantic interpretation. The reality is more prosaic. Public facilities survive because they have constituencies that support them, revenue models that work, or public agencies willing to maintain them. Private estates survive only if the owners can bear the costs, or if someone can figure out how to monetize them. The Wrigley Estate could have survived if circumstances had been different. If Philip Wrigley had been more like his father, more willing to take risks and subsidize losses, maybe he would have held on until tourism rebounded enough to make it viable. If World War II hadn't disrupted everything, maybe the estate would have remained occupied and maintained. If post-war attitudes toward wealth hadn't changed so dramatically, maybe someone would have bought it. If estate taxes hadn't become so punitive, maybe the family could have afforded to keep it. If. History is full of might-have-beens. But what actually happened is what matters. And what happened is that one of the most spectacular private estates in American history was deliberately demolished and erased from the landscape. leaving almost no trace. Today, the Wrigley family rarely discusses the estate. The current generation, far removed from Willie and the Gilded Age, focuses on the business and the ongoing management of Catalina Island. The estate is ancient history, a footnote to the family story. The Catalina Island Company, still controlled by the Wrigley Family Trust, manages tourism on the island. But they don't promote the lost estate. There's no marker indicating where it stood, no historic site designation, no tours to the ruins because there are no ruins. The whole episode seems to be something the family prefers to forget. And perhaps that's their right. It's their history, their family story, their decision about what to preserve and what to forget. But from a historical and cultural perspective, the loss is significant. The Wrigley Estate represented something important about American ambition and the Gilded Age's sunset. It showed that even in the 1920s, even after the original Gilded Age had ended, wealthy Americans were still building spectacular private estates. It demonstrated that fortunes built on consumer products, not just railroads and steel, could rival the old money. And its destruction demonstrated how quickly things can change, how economic and social forces can make the impossible inevitable. In a way, the Wrigley Estate's complete disappearance makes it more fascinating than if it had survived. Its absence creates mystery. The few photographs that exist show glimpses of beauty and grandeur, but leave so much to imagination. What were the interior rooms like? How did the morning light look coming through those windows? What did it feel like to stand on those terraces and look out at the Pacific? We'll never fully know, and there's something haunting about that. Biltmore and the Newport mansions are known quantities. You can visit them, photograph them, experience them. They're well documented, but the Wrigley Estate exists in that liminal space between memory and myth. Old-timers on Catalina Island will tell you stories about it, though many are probably exaggerated through decades of retelling. Historians piece together fragments of information from old newspapers, family archives, architectural records, but the complete story is lost. And that incompleteness, that mystery, gives the Wrigley Estate a different kind of power in our imagination. It's the great lost mansion of California, the vanished palace, the architectural ghost that haunts Catalina Island. If you're drawn to stories of lost grandeur, of might-have-beens, of things that once were magnificent and are no more, the Wrigley Estate is a perfect subject. It encapsulates so much of what's compelling about Gilded Age history: the ambition, the excess, the beauty, the impermanence. Standing on that hillside today, knowing what once was there, you feel the weight of time and change. Nature has reclaimed the space. The Pacific Ocean continues its eternal rhythms, indifferent to human ambitions. The winds blow through the scrub brush exactly as they blew around the mansion's walls. And somewhere under your feet, buried beneath decades of soil and vegetation, fragments remain. A piece of tile, a chunk of foundation, a remnant of the irrigation system. Physical evidence that something magnificent once existed here, but you'd never know unless someone told you. And soon, even the people who can tell you will be gone. The last people who remember the estate, who heard stories from their grandparents, who saw the photographs in family albums, they're elderly now. Within another generation, the living memory will be completely gone. The Wrigley Estate will exist only in archives and history books, a footnote to the larger story of Gilded Age excess and Depression-era collapse. This is how history works. Things fade, stories are lost, buildings crumble or are demolished. The physical evidence of the past disappears, leaving only documents and images, and eventually, even those are forgotten by all but specialists. But perhaps there's value in telling these forgotten stories. The Wrigley Estate deserves to be remembered, not just as a curiosity, but as a significant example of American architecture and history. Willie Wrigley Jr.'s vision deserves recognition, even if his estate doesn't survive. The craftsmanship and artistry that went into its creation deserve acknowledgement, and the lessons about permanence, legacy, and the relationship between private luxury and public good deserve consideration, because we're still building today. Billionaires still create massive estates, though now they call them compounds and fill them with technology instead of servants. The impulse that drove Willie to build his palace on Catalina Island still exists in human nature. We want to create, to build, to leave our mark. But what will survive from our era? Will today's mega mansions be tomorrow's forgotten ruins? Will future generations look at photographs of our architectural achievements and wonder why we demolished them? The Wrigley Estate suggests the answer is probably yes. Most of what we build will vanish. The Gilded Age mansions that survive are exceptions, not the rule. For every Biltmore, there are dozens of demolished estates. For every Hearst castle preserved as a park, there are hundreds of forgotten mansions. This is the natural order. Buildings are temporary. Even the pyramids are crumbling. Even the Colosseum is a ruin. Everything returns to dust eventually. The Wrigley Estate just got there faster than most, helped along by deliberate human decisions. But knowing this doesn't make the loss less real. Something beautiful was created and then destroyed. That's worth mourning, even if only briefly, even if only by those of us interested in architectural history and Gilded Age stories. Willie Wrigley Jr. built his fortune on selling people small pleasures, 5 cents worth of chewing gum that made life slightly more enjoyable. In building his estate, he was creating his own pleasure, his own small paradise in a complicated world. For a brief moment in history, that paradise existed. It was real. People walked those terraces, swam in that ocean, enjoyed those views, lived in those beautiful rooms. And then it was gone, deliberately erased, reduced to fragments and fading memories. This is the dark story of the Wrigley Estate. Not a story of disaster or scandal, but something perhaps more unsettling. A story of rational choices, economic inevitability, and the impermanence of even our most ambitious dreams. Willie built his palace. His son demolished it. And now, most people don't even know it existed. In the end, maybe that's the darkest part of all. Not the demolition itself, but the forgetting. The way something so magnificent can simply vanish from collective memory, leaving barely a trace. The Wrigley Estate is lost, but its story at least can be told. And in the telling, perhaps we preserve something that the demolition tried to erase. The memory that once, on a hillside above the Pacific, a man who started with nothing built something extraordinary. It didn't last. But for a moment, it was glorious. And that moment, preserved in faded photographs and fragmented stories, reminds us of both the heights of human ambition and the depths of impermanence. Build your castles, dream your dreams, but know that time and tide wait for no one, and even the grandest estates eventually return to dust.